Hello, I'm Michael Dowd. I'd like to speak on the topic of ecology as theology, decline as grace. Little background for those of you who are not familiar with my ministry. My wife, Connie Barlow, is a science writer, and I'm a minister, and we, for the last 18 years, have traveled North America doing programs in some 500 Unitarian Universalist churches and hundreds of other churches and colleges and universities. And basically where science, inspiration, and sustainability intersect is what we speak about. And from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, I pastored 3 churches. I then did environmental sustainability and community organizing work for 5 years. And then we've been living on the road for 18 years doing this itinerant sort of evolutionary evangelism. And then for the last 7 years, climate change has become front and center, and deep sustainability. And what I find myself almost always doing now, especially in a coronavirus era, is everybody I talk to, I try to bring understanding, I try to invite remembering, and then show people how they can be inspiring to others. It's not so much searching for inspiration or finding inspiration, is that there are proven ways, evidential ways that we can be inspiration to others, that we can be hope for others. So let me just take these one at a time. So what is it to understand the nature of reality and our place in reality, our time? Well, the most important thing is to understand the nested relational nature of reality, that subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, all the way up and all the way down, like nesting dolls. That's the nature of reality. And every sustainable culture has related to primary reality as primary. They treated the biosphere as like God, for example, or some divine thou rather than a lesser it. So it turns out there's 2 ways of relating to nested reality. One is sustainably, the first 98% of human history. The other is unsustainably, the last 2 or 3% of human history. Sustainability is marked. It's the indigenous heart and the indigenous mind. It's marked with a sense of reverence and respect and attention to the well-being of everything we depend upon is more important than us. So the only measures of progress or well-being that make any sense and that have ever shown themselves to be sustainable are how well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well are the forests doing decade by decade? What are the other species doing decade by decade? How well are they doing? All the different aspects of what we live on. I'm speaking to you from outside of Eureka, California. This is a redwood tree behind me. And so we're sequestered here among these amazing beings that instill humility simply to be in their presence. But we can all come back to an indigenous heart and an indigenous mind by exercising humility. The other thing to understand is that we are in a time of contraction, not expansion. The first 97, 98% of human history, it was all about stability. As little change as possible. It was about passing on the wisdom from the past and passing it faithfully on to the future. The idea of doing in the present moment what would be judged by the 7th generation, that's just not a good idea. It's to do otherwise is evil. We have to live in a way that's accountable to the past and a way that's accountable to the future. In fact, you could say that that's the definition of sustainability. Sustainability is living accountable to the past, accountable to the future. Unsustainability is living unaccountable. And it turns out that our notions of progress, human-centered progress, not factoring in the fact that human-centered progress that degrades primary reality, human-centered progress that destroys the foundations of human existence is not sustainable. So we know of over 100 examples in the last 7,000 or 8,000 years of civilizations that became great, city-based civilizations, and then they collapsed. And another one becomes great and it collapses. There was a major article in the BBC in February of 2019 called "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And the author, Luke Kemp, documents 88 civilizations and shows how long they lasted and where they were and what they died of and everything else. And this was just from 4000 BC, before the Common Era, to 1000 of the Common Era. So that 5,000 year period. He doesn't look at the last 1,000 years and he doesn't look before 4,000. That's why the actual figure of boom and bust cultures, not to be confused with sustainable cultures, boom and bust civilizations, is over 120. And so it turns out that human-centeredness, anthropocentrism, is the key to unsustainable civilizations. It's all about measuring progress by how well individuals and groups of individuals, in today's world, corporations and nation states are doing, rather than how well is the living world upon which we depend. So that's the most important thing to understand, is that we're related to reality, that we're an expression of reality, that reality is divine, whether we use mythic language or secular language for that. And ultimately, we need to treat primary reality as primary. And the fact that we haven't been doing that for several thousand years, and especially the last several hundred years, means that we are in decline, classically in decline. And that's unstoppable. And so understanding that allows us to go, oh, of course, of course, of course. It allows us to be engaged, those of us who are activists, as activists, but not from the place of in order to, not from the place of preventing civilization from collapsing. We know that can't be done. But to do everything we can to make a difference in the locations we can and at the scale that we can, to plant seeds so that after industrial civilization hits the wall and then the rubble stops bouncing, there are healthy forms of religiosity, healthy forms of culture. So understanding our situation. After understanding comes remembering. Remember who we are, where we are, why we are, and what matters most. Very simply, remembering that we are not separate from nature. We're not separate from the universe. We are part of nature. We are life becoming aware of itself. As many people have spoken about, we are stardust, now evolved to the place that the stardust can contemplate its own nature, its own story. So we're part of the body of life. We're not its masters. The idea of man, conqueror of nature, is probably the single most self-destructive thought form in human history. So remember who we are. We're life, becoming aware of itself. We're part of the body of life, not its masters. Where we are, well, where we are is at the end of the Cenozoic era. We're bringing to an end a 65 million year era. That is, we're changing the geology, biology, the chemistry of the planet on that scale. Well, that's pretty depressing if that's where we stop. So where we are in time is also at the end of this global civilization, with some hope, unless climate change wigs out so severely that we all go extinct in the next 50 years, which, make no mistake, is possible. But if that doesn't happen, and there are pockets of humanity that survive, which I think there's a good chance, we're planting the seeds of, I call it the prodigal species, humanity, the prodigal species. Yes, we've squandered our inheritance, but we're waking up to our predicament in the pig pen, as it were, and coming home to God, to life, to reality, to the biosphere as divine. Who we are, where we are, why we are. Well, that's obviously a subjective question. Our purpose, our mission. I suggest to you that in all sustainable cultures, their reason for being was to honor the past and be a blessing to the future. And when we choose to see that as our raison d'etre, that is our reason for being, that is our purpose, then we can shift, we can repent from our human-centeredness and our human-centered ways and regain an indigenous mind and an indigenous heart, and let the indigenous leaders of the world serve as models for how to do that. The idea that industrial humanity is the pinnacle of human evolution is crazy. So we can come home to a green heart, a red-green heart. And then finally, so who are we? Where are we? Why are we? And what matters most? What we know is that what matters most are our relationships, our communities, the health and well-being of those that we love. So finally, after understanding that we're in decline and that we're part of the body of life, and it's a nested body of life that we're part of, remembering who we are, where we are, why we are, and what matters most. And then finally, how do we be inspiration for each other? I'll go into this in much greater depth in my Zoom evening program. But suffice it to say that we get to be inspiration by having completion conversations. One of the greatest gifts of COVID-19 is that most of us realize that there's a possibility that we could die in the next year. There's a possibility that we could die and our loved ones could die in the next 2 years. And so knowing that that's a possibility, it may only be a 5 or 10% possibility, but knowing that, we don't want to be in the situation of the people that we've been reading about who end up going to the hospital, their friends and family can't visit them, they have to die alone, and they can't even have completion conversations. So now, before you get COVID, now is the time to have the conversations of expressing gratitude to all the people in your life that you can remember and can communicate with who have been a blessing to you. To communicate regret and sorrow to the people that you've had a negative impact on in some way. In some cases, like when I had cancer 10 years ago and I went through this process of having completion conversations, there were 2 people that the only thing I could say was, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I know what a shit I was. And if I could go back and do it again, I'd do it differently. So expressing regret, expressing sorrow. The third is to express acknowledgement, to acknowledge people for whatever it is that people love to be acknowledged, and to simply acknowledge. It's not the same as gratitude, but it's simply saying, you know, I just want to acknowledge what a great communicator you are. I don't think I've ever told you. Or I want to acknowledge how well you listen, or I want to acknowledge whatever it is. So to acknowledge people, to express gratitude, to express regret or sorrow, and then finally, obviously, to express love to the people that you love. Now is the time to do that. And that is the gift of our time. And that way you get to be hope for others, not grasping what can give us hope, but you get to be in a way that others find hopeful. You get to be in a way that others find deeply inspiring. This is a holy time. That's the grace, I suggest, of decline, is that we don't put off these kinds of vitally important conversations. That anybody that's gone through a depression or a war will tell you that it's the difficult times that can bring out the best of us. May that happen for you. Amen.